The turmoil of the 1930s increasingly led to direct confrontations and began to point toward an oncoming conflict, perhaps of global consequence. Hitler's challenges to the Treaty of Versailles in Europe went from sort of philosophical challenges to physical challenges to literally confrontation. Benito Mussolini supported colonial adventurism, a successful attempt to conquer Ethiopia, the roots of establishing a new Roman Empire. And in East Asia, Japanese militarists' efforts inside of Manchuria and China, and the fact that these campaigns were drawing the Europeans and the Americans more into the region, led to a growing conflict. The unity of these three and the tripartite pact presented a real challenge to stability and security in the world. The events that led to the attack on Poland in September of 1939, I suppose, were inevitable given the weak and disorganized response of the French, the British, and the Americans to the growing aggressiveness of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. The other members of the Tripartite Pact followed that lead, and warfare was the general rule by the fall of 1939. Hitler's attack on Poland came surprisingly for the Western powers after an unusual and unexpected agreement with Joseph Stalin, a non-aggression pact between the fascist Nazis and the communist Bolshevik government in the Soviet Union. Politically, these two should be enemies, and the other Western countries, the British, the French, the Americans, had always suspected that Hitler and Stalin's governments would face off. So this non-aggression pact was frightening, to say the least. Hitler's aggressive moves into Poland were mirrored by the same from Stalin. As Hitler invaded from the west, the Soviets invaded from the east, and Poland fell very quickly. Now, the invasion did bring war declarations from Britain and France, but those two were able to offer little real material assistance to the Poles. The British responded by once again sending an expeditionary force to France, but Poland was more or less left on its own. After Poland fell, the Soviets launched an aggression against Finland, which none of the Western powers were really able to act to, but otherwise, winter of 1939-40 passed fairly quietly. Spring of 1940, however, saw the Nazis again move out very aggressively against their neighbors, initially in Scandinavia, against Denmark and Norway, but then by early spring against France itself. And the attack on France was very quick, was devastating. The French, though, with a large army, were unprepared for the kind of mobile warfare that the Germans practiced. The Germans were able to divide and piecemeal conquer the French within 6 weeks. And so Adolf Hitler had done, in a little over a month, what the Kaiser's armies had failed to do in 4 years. This defeat of France left Britain as the sole opponent to a Nazified Europe. The Italians had kicked in with the Germans right at the last minute, just before France collapsed. So the fascists are now running Europe, and Britain is on its own. The remnant of the French, Adolf Hitler literally absorbs the northern parts of France and importantly, all of coastal France. And he's going to launch his submarines from bases along that. The sort of rump of French autonomy is focused in the south, in a small town called Vichy. The Vichy French still control that bit of southern France and France's African colonies. They are collaborationist with the Nazis and the fascists, though still seen as potentially an ally by the British and the Americans in recovering Europe. Britain is now under siege, basically, from the Nazis. Adolf Hitler tasks his air force, the Luftwaffe, with softening up British resistance and preparing for an eventual invasion. This leads to, in the fall of 1940, what comes to be known as the Battle of Britain. Technology helps the British out. British radar and code-breaking efforts work to help the British stand up to this threat. Also a critical decision by Adolf Hitler midway through the Battle of Britain to turn his focus from specifically military targets to civilian targets in an effort to break Britain's will is very important. It gives the military a bit of a breathing space. And the British will does not crack. The British prove to be very resilient in the face of direct attack, the Blitz, on their urban areas. But they're also seeking assistance from the Americans. They're also seeking assistance from their empire. Now, the Soviet Union is holding back in this, again seen as a potential foe for the Germans. By the spring of 1941, Adolf Hitler attributes a lot of British resiliency to the fact that the Soviets are still out there and presenting a theoretical threat. And so in 1941, disastrously for the Germans, Adolf Hitler is going to turn the cream of his military, his ground military, against the Soviet Union in a devastating invasion of Eastern Europe and then deep into the heart of the Soviet Union as well, in an effort to knock the Soviets out and in this way hopefully kick the last prop out from underneath the British. Initially this looks like a very successful move. The Germans are able to gain tremendous amounts of Soviet territory and move deep into their heartland. Though the Soviets retreat, the phrase is trading space for time, the Soviets pull back, protect a few key cities, but move a lot of their crucial industry back as far as the Ural Mountains and prepare for a long, drawn-out defense of their territory. Meanwhile, on the other side of the planet, the Japanese have found that their gains in Manchuria and even their gains in China haven't really delivered the kind of material resources they need, haven't brought them the kind of successes that's going to be required for long-term growth, and find now that that fascist success in Europe has left a lot of European colonies vulnerable. British Malaysia, the Dutch East Indies, French Indochina, all of these countries are either occupied or completely taken up with the threat at home. And the Japanese decide that that southern resources region is the area that they really need to secure their imperial future. The one remaining stumbling block to that is the American forces in the Philippines and the American Navy in Hawaii now that's defending those forces. And so in December of 1941, the Japanese launch a secret and extremely successful attack on the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, doing it massive damage. Yes, they missed the aircraft carriers, but the battleship fleet was devastated, and that was the true target of this attack. Following that success, the Japanese Navy is able to accomplish nearly all of those imperial goals. They seize the territories that had belonged to the European imperial powers. They get British Malaysia. They get the Dutch East Indies. They get French Indochina. They even land on New Guinea and imperil Australia. All of this by way of expanding to a massive, in fact you could argue beyond their resources, sized empire that surrounds a big chunk of the Pacific and threatens American hold in that area. The last remaining imperial holdout is the American Philippines, and by May of 1942, even they have fallen. So the beginning of the war seems to be going all the way of the tripartite pact of the Germans, the Italians, and the Japanese. The critical factor here is, though, that in terms of material resources, in terms of deep capabilities, they're going to be outweighed if they don't win fast. And so this initial success has to be followed up with a devastating political diplomatic success and break the will of the opponents. It's not what happens, but we'll talk about it next time.